Dr. Collins, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Christian. It's nice to be with you and talk about something that I think is really important.
I mean, so important, which is why we want you on the program to explain. So you had, in any event, ended your term as head of the NIH. You stepped down, I think, in 21, but you were leading another lab. And in the full, daylight of the cuts and the threats by President Trump, you decided that you needed to leave, right? You needed to resign or leave the NIH. Just tell me what went in your thinking and why did you do that?
It became untenable to continue to be there. All kinds of restrictions were placed on the research we were trying to do. You weren't allowed to order supplies. You weren't allowed to start any new projects, only old things. Staff were being fired with no justification whatsoever. And we were also muzzled and told you're not allowed to speak even at a scientific meeting in any way because of concern that you might say something critical. I felt distinctly unwelcome. And it seemed as if I was going to have any useful role to play here, it would have to be outside of NIH.
Just a personal question. It must have been devastating for you as such a long-time linchpin of the NIH and for your staff who you went to tell. What was that last meeting like?
Oh, Christian, there were a lot of tears, including mine. I've been there for 32 years because I ran a lab the whole time I was at NIH, including during the Genome Project and when I was director. It was an amazing place with amazingly dedicated people. And to have it come to this, I could not have imagined a circumstance like this. And then there it was. And yeah, there was a lot of heartbreak. And there continues to be as we see this amazing engine for discovery that's been built over decades and has been the envy of the world, the way that NIH and its partners in the private sector and philanthropy have managed to make discoveries that are absolutely breathtaking, things I didn't think would happen in my lifetime. And now it's being devastated by decisions made by individuals who seem not particularly interested in the consequences. It's heartless, it's careless, and it's deeply damaging to something that I think all Americans would not want to see happening.
No, I'm sure they wouldn't. Healthcare is obviously a major topic for all Americans. But I want to then ask you, is this a scientific rationale or is it ideological? How do you measure the rationale for these cuts?
Well, some of it is ideological, but it's politically ideological. 2,500 grants at NIH have been terminated without really any serious explanation. Some of them decisions made in minutes by somebody with no scientific training, simply by searching for keywords that might be things they don't want to support. Many of those grants were reviewed by peers of experts over many months before a decision was made about whether this was in the sort of top 20% of the ideas that come to NIH, and then eliminated in 2 minutes by a non-scientist. That's unimaginable at any time before now.
So now tell me, if you can, what exactly is the consequence of this? What in terms of your research and the effect on people's health in the US and around the world?
Well, there are immediate consequences for people who are depending on medical research to potentially come up with an answer to the circumstances they were facing. I could tell you about Natalie Phelps, somebody who's in her 30s, afflicted with stage 4 colorectal cancer, who was on a pathway towards a clinical trial of immunotherapy at NIH, which she and many other people refer to as the National Institutes of Hope, because that's what they need right now. And because of staff cuts, that got slowed down. By the time maybe she could have enrolled in it, she already had a metastasis to the brain and was no longer eligible. So real consequences there. I could tell you about young kids who have rare diseases who are counting on advances, which are happening right now at remarkable pace with things like CRISPR and gene editing, who basically their parents are wondering, is there going to be anything happening now, because they have been essentially slowed to a crawl by the cuts that have been made in that kind of research as well. And people who are worried about Alzheimer's disease, as we all must as we get older, likewise, those grants also have been seriously slowed because of the attacks on universities, where much of this research is done.
There has been an attempt to go to the courts and to claw this back. A federal judge in Boston last month ruled that the NIH had to restore some grant cuts on the basis of gender ideology or DEI. Said the termination was illegal. And the judge, who was a Reagan appointee, said, "I've sat on this bench now for 40 years. I've never seen government racial discrimination like this." What did he mean by racial discrimination, and how do you have any hope that it will be restored under the new NIH director, for instance? Because all of this happened before he was in place.
That's very true. So Dr. Bhattacharya is now presiding over an organization that I know he wants to flourish, but in a place where great harms have already been done. I think the judge's comments related to the way in which any effort to understand diversity was now seen as unacceptable, which in many ways was eliminating efforts to understand health disparities. Why is it that certain populations have a much less likelihood of living a full life without being stricken by disease? We need to understand that, and yet that falls under this same umbrella of DEI that is now considered a bad word in the current administration. I got to say, Christiane, the other thing that worries me about all this is what the long-term consequences are. People don't realize that when a breakthrough happens, like the cure of sickle cell disease, which has now happened, or that people with cystic fibrosis now can plan for retirement instead of an early death, those take years of painstaking work that is funded by the federal government before a company would ever get interested in something that might ultimately be a product. There's all this basic science that has to get done. The absolute mainstay of American success in that regard has been the way in which the federal government has invested in that kind of basic science through NIH. And cutting that off means that the future breakthroughs that we all hope for are going to be much less likely to happen.
Dr. Collins, we just mentioned Dr. Bhattacharya, the new NIH head. You and he had a bit of a go-to, a bit of a contretemps, if I could put it that way, during COVID. This is what he said about you to our colleague Walter Isaacson.
I've had now an opportunity to meet one-on-one with Francis Collins, and we've forgiven each other for whatever has happened. So he called us fringe epidemiologists, and he called for a devastating takedown of the premises of the declaration, which then led to like death threats and all this kind of nasty stuff. That was an abuse of power.
Your reaction?
Well, we have met and we have basically agreed to try to move on from this. I still strongly disagree with the premises of the Great Barrington Declaration. I think that would have led to the deaths of tens of thousands of additional people from COVID. But I regret the intemperate language that was used in an email which was supposed to be private and which became public later on. So let's put that part aside. I don't really think that's an appropriate representation of what one tries to do as the director of the National Institutes of Health. You try to see what can you do to help people. I'm not a politician. I'm not power hungry. I'm a scientist. I'm a doctor. I want to try to help find those breakthroughs that everybody is counting on. And it worries me deeply if something comes along that's going to get in the way of that. And that feels like something that requires a response.
You've said that you regret perhaps some of the communication that came from the podiums during COVID, that there was such certainty as opposed to admitting that actually this is an evolving situation. Tell me about what you think you guys could have done better with 2020 hindsight.
Yeah, with hindsight, I think in that crisis, when the information about the COVID virus was very incomplete, we did the best we could. And I hope people will understand that was an honorable effort to try to share information that we thought would be most likely to save lives. But it was often based upon incomplete evidence, and it had to be changed later when we knew more about what was happening. I just wish every time that somebody like me had been in front of a camera, we would have said at the outset, this is an evolving situation. This is the best we can do right now, but it might have to be revised. And then people wouldn't be so surprised when it did get changed later on. I think we lost some of the confidence of the public because of those changes that were made. And we maybe could have avoided that if we'd been more clear about the uncertainty part. But Christiane, let me say, maybe 20% of the public loss of trust during COVID could be traced to some of those missteps that were made by the public communication efforts. 80% of it was done by all of the misinformation and disinformation that was being spread wildly across the internet, sometimes by politicians. I've heard no apologies for that.
Yeah, I want to get to some of that, especially in the wake of the new Secretary of Health and Human Services and his essential dissing and dismantling of a vaccine program in the US and around the world. But first, I want to ask you something that I'm not really, on top of, but this gain of function research. President Trump has called it a dangerous, research. Others don't like it. It was going on apparently in the Wuhan lab. Tell me, what are the pitfalls with that? What are the facts and the pitfalls?
Well, my goodness, there's a lot of confusion and noise about just even that terminology of gain of function, because in everyday usage, that's something that we consider actually a good thing. When my daughter took piano lessons, I was hoping she would achieve a gain of function as a result. But for things that we wanted to be very careful about, gain of function referred to when you're studying a pathogen that could cause human disease and doing things to it that might actually make it more pathogenic. That should only be done with extremely high justification under extremely careful conditions in a high security system. And the US had a very careful set of plans that were developed over quite a few years about how to allow, if you were going to allow that, those very stringent circumstances. So the system was in place. Did the Wuhan Institute of Virology carry out any of those dangerous kinds of gain of function experiments? They might have done so secretly. The part that NIH was funding as part of a subcontract would not have allowed that because it would have been against those rules. But it is so elevated, this issue, and caused a lot of understandable anxiety about, wait a minute, what's happening in those labs? And now I think in an example of what feels like overreach, the government has now decided to stop a lot of research, including some very valuable things on tuberculosis, for instance, because it falls under this same label.
Yeah.
And there were very careful recommendations made about this in the past. At the moment, they've kind of been pushed aside by a sweeping prohibition against research, which might actually be things we really want to know and doesn't carry the same kind of risk.
And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a known vaccine skeptic, and no matter what he told his confirmation hearings, he's done things that he said he wouldn't do. He's sidelined the expert panel at the CDC. He's pulled US funding, or he says he will, out of the Gavi program, which is vaccines for internationals and people, the poorest of the poor. What is this going to do, this kind of ideology and non-scientific approach going to do to America and actually to the rest of the world?
Well, when you mix politics and science, you just get politics. And that, I'm afraid, is the circumstance we're seeing right now in the United States. And certainly when it comes to vaccines, which have saved tens of millions of lives, hundreds of millions of lives globally over time, to have this put into a circumstance of casting so much doubt about the efficacy is truly heartbreaking and dangerous. Look what's happening right now in our country with measles. We have the highest level of cases of measles in 33 years because of the reduction in vaccine receptivity in certain communities. And that is not being helped by a government that seems to suggest that maybe these vaccines are not safe after all. And basically, I think all of us pretty distraught to see the dismantling of the oversight process represented by ACIP, which is now had its members dismissed and new members put forward. Love to see the conflict of interest statements from those new members, which have not yet been released, because many of them do seem to come at this with a less than objective perspective. And that's not what you need. You want the absolutely most rigorous data. My book, The Road to Wisdom, talks about this. Have we begun to slip away from a dependence on objective truth? Do we believe that that matters? It almost seems as if people are allowed to reject facts that they don't like.
Yes, well,
Our
Dr.
society
Collins,
will not flourish that way.
welcome to our world as well. It's terrible how disinformation and selective truths have affected, journalism as well. But I want to ask you finally, it's crazy from an administration that brought Operation Warp Speed and, brought the vaccines that saved so many people during COVID. That was the Trump administration. So how does it make you feel that the Trump 2.0 cuts, is essentially causing a brain drain amongst your greatest scientists? and or your young scientists rather. How does that make you feel as a patrician doctor and scientist? What do the young people say to you? What do you say to them?
They're deeply demoralized. I talk a lot to young scientists right now as sort of a mentor, and sometimes it feels like therapy because they are deeply troubled about whether there's a future for them in the United States. Most universities now under attack have stopped creating new faculty positions or hiring postdocs. And so people don't know if there's any place for them to go. Many young people, as many as 2/3 in one poll I saw, are considering leaving the United States to go somewhere else, like the UK or Europe or Australia, or if they speak other languages, other countries, because they see a better chance there. That is just astoundingly horrible to contemplate. The United States has benefited so much in the last half a century by being the place where everybody wanted to come, because this is where the greatest science was going to happen, and you'd be able to live out your dreams and make those next breakthroughs. But politics has found its way in there. And politics has to have winners and losers. When it comes to medical research and health, everybody loses if that's cut. The only winners, frankly, Christiane, are going to be China, because after all, they've been trying to outcompete the US in the last several years in biomedical research. They probably can't believe their luck right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Francis Collins.
Thank you, Christiane.